to this beautiful lecture hall, which I see has been repainted since the last time we used it, for this afternoon's lectures, the beginning of a two-day set of lectures, the Conway Lectures that the Medieval Institute offers annually, usually in early September. These lectures are in honor of our late benefactor, Robert Conway, who was a Notre Dame alumnus and member of the Board of Trustees for many years, and whose endowments that he set up for the Institute are the resources that pay for most of the programming that we do during the course of the year. So we're pleased every year to offer these lectures, and we hope if Ricki Conway, his wife, is watching, that she knows that we are ever in Robert Conway's debt for his commitment to and support of the Medieval Institute. This year's lectures are collectively focused on late medieval European political thought, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce my colleague from the program in Liberal Studies, Denis Robichaud, who will introduce our first speaker. Denis.
Well, thank you, Tom, for the introductions, and I want to extend a welcome to all of you to the first of the Conway Lecture Series, online as well, too, and it's a real privilege to introduce our first speaker. Takashi Shogimen is a professor of history at the University of Otago in New Zealand, but he obtained his PhD in medieval history from the University of Sheffield and held a position as a research fellow at Clare in Cambridge prior to going to the University of Otago. He's also a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and a foreign member of the Academia Europea. He's extremely prolific, has published over 12 books in English and in Japanese, and over 50 articles and book chapters. I'll mention Ockham Political Discourse in the Late Middle Ages, published by Cambridge University Press in 2007, The Birth of European Political Thought in 2013, which won the Suntory Prize, apparently a very important prize in Japan, as well as he edited a recent volume, Rethinking Medieval and Renaissance Political Thought with Routledge in 2023. He's also contributed to the history of religion, medieval religion, with an article, I would say, called Rethinking Heresy from the Journal of the Academy of Religion as well, too. So please join me in welcoming Professor Takashi Shogimen to the stage.
Well, thank you very much for your generous introduction. And I would like to thank the Medieval Institute of the University of Notre Dame, especially Professor Thomas Berman and Dr. Megan Hall for the kind invitation to this event. And thank you all for coming. It is a tremendous pleasure and indeed a privilege for me to speak to you today. As the presidential election is imminent, patriotic sentiments are rampant in every corner of the United States. Patriotism has made a comeback to a public discourse, not only in the United States, but also in many other countries around the world in the recent decades after a lull in the post-Second World War era. Meanwhile, patriotism is integral to the European political discourse and its tradition, and has a long, complicated, and somewhat elusive history. Strangely, patriotism is sometimes treated as an offshoot, mere offshoot of nationalism, even though patriotism has a much longer history than nationalism. Indeed, patriotism has ancient Greco-Roman ancestry, while nationalism is distinctively modern, according to some, and originated in the Middle Ages, according to others. So, how should we acquire a historical understanding of patriotism? Now, in this talk, I would like to propose what I call the three prototypes of patriotism, namely military patriotism, civil patriotism, and endemic patriotism. Perhaps military patriotism is a commonplace. Civil patriotism may be less so. And you're surely puzzled by endemic patriotism, which is indeed my own original concept I am developing. I introduce these three prototypes for heuristic purposes in the hope that they help narrate the history of patriotism comprehensively without compromising its complexity. Medieval Europe was witness to the rise of patriotism in all three prototypical forms. Medieval variations of a military and a civil patriotism are historiographically a well-trod terrain. Now, in what follows, I shall touch upon military and civil patriotism briefly before turning to before examining the rise of endemic patriotism in the late Middle Ages. In foregrounding endemic patriotism, I'm not suggesting that it is historically the most significant aspect of medieval patriotism, let alone recommending it normatively as the most desirable. Rather, I would like to argue that the idea of patria was fluid in the Middle Ages. However, endemic patriotism played a significant role in coagulating it, as if the object of patriotic loyalty could be nothing other than one's own country of birth. By highlighting endemic patriotism, I would also like to address a central issue around patriotism, that is, what constitutes the ultimate object of patriotic loyalty? In short, what is the patria? If the history of patriotism teaches us anything, the lesson would be that we ought to ask that question. I think the history of patriotism serves as a reminder that today we often take the answer to that question for granted too easily, believing that patriotism is necessarily about loyalty to one's country. Now, I would like to mention three things before I offer my historical account of medieval patriotism. First, about the term itself. The word patriotism is relatively new. As far as I can determine, that English word did not circulate before the 1650s. Before the mid-17th century, patriotism was known as amor patriae, which was typically translated in early modern England as love of country. My account of patriotism in the Middle Ages, therefore, revolves around the discourses on the vocabulary of patriotism, including patria, its vernacular translations, and the love of it. My second point concerns the nature of my three prototypes. As you will see in this lecture, the three prototypes are not mutually exclusive. They can be juxtaposed consistently by the same thinker. One type may present itself metaphorically in another. Two types may be even blended together. The three prototypes concern as much substance as mode. In other words, they are defined not only by what it is about, but also how it is expressed. Put it another way, they are the three centers of one and the same idea. Depending on the weightings on each center, patriotism can take a variety of forms. Third and finally, the word contributions in my lecture title entails no normative judgment on my part. This lecture is not intended to advocate for any form of patriotism. The choice of the word contributions expresses my two desires. One is to align my lecture with the theme of the Conway Lectures this year, which highlights the legacy of a medieval political thought, and the other is to emulate and pay tribute to one of the great historians of medieval political thought of the last century, Alexander Passerin d'Antrèves, whose magnificent oeuvre include the book entitled The Medieval Contribution to Political Thought. Okay, here's the first prototype, military patriotism. As you can easily guess, it glorifies fighting in defense of patria, typically in the military context. The quintessential expressions of military patriotism include such Latin phrases as pugna pro patria and pro patria mori. Its classical source can be traced back to Homer's Iliad, in which Hector says, I quote, "There is no better omen than to fight for one's country." In the ancient Roman times, Virgil used the phrase amor patriae in his portrayal of the death of Camilla in Aeneid. But perhaps the best-known example would be Horace. The Latin expression pro patria mori originates from his famous dictum, "It is sweet and fitting to die for the country." The obligation of dying for patria was also asserted by Cicero. Without a military patriotism, Scipio Africanus would not have defended Rome from the threat of Carthage. Cicero wrote, I quote, "For the patria it is our duty to die, to her to give ourselves entirely, to place on her altar, and, as it were, to dedicate to her service all that we possess." Medieval variations of military patriotism, which drew on those classical sources, often through Cato's distichs of late antiquity, have been discussed famously by Ernst Kantorowicz and more recently by Norman Housley. Kantorowicz traced the historical changes of the idea of corpus mysticum, first signifying the Eucharist, next the organization of the church, and finally the secular communities. This way, he highlighted the process where the convergence of corpus mysticum and the patria, which sacralized the secular political community. Meanwhile, Housley characterized medieval military patriotism as sanctified patriotism to underscore the belief that the fighting in defense of patria was sacred. So sanctified patriotism is underpinned by a belief that God makes active intervention in the military action of men, the justification of which derives from divine providence. The people who took military action motivated by sanctified patriotism viewed themselves as a chosen people who were instrumental to the accomplishment of divine will, thereby being meritorious. The chosen people, however, was confined to warriors. Moved by sanctified patriotism, soldiers were expected to die for their patria as a holy land in the fighting in its defense. Now, the patria to be defended in this context, in the context of the First Crusade, was Jerusalem. And this illustrates the Christian sanction on medieval military patriotism, but it was also a departure, significant departure from the patristic tradition. St. Augustine of Hippo had rejected Cicero's claim that patria was a this worldly community such as Rome. For St. Augustine, the true patria was for St. Augustine, the true patria was the kingdom of God. St. Augustine thus criticized Ciceronian idealization of this worldly patria and expelled the patria to the other world. Medieval military patriotism brought the patria back to this world. However, the patria in the medieval military patriotism was not limited to Jerusalem, nor was it Rome as the caput mundi. Indeed, the complex political reality of medieval Christendom allowed the canonists and Roman law commentators to argue that the patria to be defended could be a variety of political communities encompassing the empire, the church, Italian city-states, kingdoms, and the principalities. Indeed, when the French kingdom and its local principality were both under attack, medieval lawyers asked themselves, which was supposed to be prioritized? Is it the local principality or the French kingdom? On this thorny issue, there was no consensus among medieval lawyers. What may be described as patria was an open question. In short, medieval military patriotism rehabilitated the ancient martial virtue of pro patria mori, thus sacralizing this worldly patria. However, what constitutes the patria was not self-evident in the context of a multi-layered political structure of a medieval European society. Now, my second prototype is civil patriotism. As a classical source of civil patriotism, I would single out Cicero. I noted earlier that Cicero preached the duty for a patriot to die for his patria. However, Cicero's emphasis on self-sacrifice should not be understood primarily in the military sense. Cicero claimed that instances of civic courage should demand greater energy and greater devotion than the courage of the soldier. This prioritization of civic service was anchored in Cicero's well-known distinction between human and bestial qualities. As Cicero states, I quote, "There are two ways of settling a dispute. First, by discussion. Second, by physical force. And since the former is the characteristic of man, the latter of the brute, we must resort to force only in case we may not avail ourselves of discussion." Cicero observed that military force represents the animalistic aspect of human nature. The recourse to the distinctively human capabilities of discussion, not violence, should prevail in settling a dispute. For Cicero, the noble life consists in fulfilling the duty of returning the service that is due to the community that brings about happiness. Moral life thus consists in aligning an individual's good with the common good. In Cicero's words, I quote, "This then ought to be the chief end of all man, to make the interest of each individual and of the whole body politic identical. For if the individual appropriates to selfish ends what should be devoted to the common good, all human fellowship will be destroyed," Cicero said. So how did Cicero associate the common good with his idea of patria? To clarify his ultimate object of patriotic loyalty, Cicero introduced the twofold concept of patria. One is natural, and the other is civil. Natural patria is birthplace that entails affection for one's parents and nostalgia for one's youth. Civil patria, on the other hand, is the political community that citizens share in common by law. It's worth noting here that the natural patria and the civil patria do not necessarily coincide with each other. The civil patria may not be one's birthplace. So what if one cannot be loyal to both civil and natural patria at the same time? Cicero's response is unequivocal. Civil patria must be prioritized over natural patria. Cicero writes, I quote, "Parents are dear are children, relatives, friends, but patria embraces all our loves, and who that is true would hesitate to give his life for her if by his death he would render her a service." Now, what I call civil patriotism as a prototype is characterized by citizens' self-devotion to the political community in the interest of the common good, and this prototype also found advocates in the Middle Ages. For example, Ptolemy of Lucca asserted that amor patriae, love of country, is the love that prefers the common thing to one's own and deserves to be rewarded with an honorable rank. Ptolemy bolstered his claim by drawing on Cicero's on duties and Sallust's war with Catiline. Likewise, the Italian Dominican theologian of the early 14th century, Remigio de Girolami, understood patria as the common good, and for him, it was the source of all civil honors and glories. The defense of patria as a common good for him was a civic duty. Conversely, the corruption of patria would destroy the common good and prevent citizens from nurturing and practicing civic virtues. Effectively, in the corrupt patria, citizens could no longer be citizens in the true sense of the word. Hence, citizens ought to fight against the corruption of patria. Patria as the common good thus constitutes the most valuable good as the basis of a civil life. Enemies of patria are those who bring about corruption, namely tyrants and self-interested citizens. Now, I'd like to single out 2 points here. First, the enemies of patria were not foreigners. They are self-interested, corrupt individuals who do not exercise civic virtues. The duty of defending patria from corruption is attributed to citizens regularly in their daily life, not merely under exceptional circumstances such as war. My second point is that the civil patriotism's emphasis on the service to the common good is predicated on the assumption that the patriotic citizens exercise political judgment. The defense of the common good as a patria from tyranny is only possible when citizens judge the political reality surrounding them. A political judgment is a sine qua non for civil patriotism. Thus, a critical judgment of government, when it fails to realize the common good, could also represent a manifestation of the love of patria. It should be easy to see these arguments are very much in line with a Ciceronian civil patriotism, but Cicero was not the only source of scholastic arguments on patriotism. St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, derived his arguments on patriotism from Aristotle. He developed the Aristotelian teleological argument in the Christian theological fashion, thereby subordinating the individual's responsibility towards the common good and ultimately to God. Aquinas acknowledged that those who are willing to sacrifice themselves for the common good would earn honor in this world and salvation in the next, although he did not forget to add that those duties were second to those owed to God and to Christendom. So to summarize, medieval civil patriotism drew on Cicero and Aristotle to enshrine the citizens' exercise of civic virtues for the sake of the common good, implicating the resistance to corruption and the tyranny constitutes a manifestation of the love of patria. The object of patriotic loyalty was a civil patria, the political community one belongs to by law, which is not necessarily one's birthplace. Now, let me turn to my third prototype, endemic patriotism. Endemic patriotism is characterized by a sentimental attachment to and a eulogy of one's patria as birthplace. Typically, endemic patriotism takes the form of the praise of beautiful natural landscape and the fertile ground. I noted earlier that Cicero had the twofold concept of patria, civil and natural. For Cicero, the natural patria was less significant than the civil patria. So prioritizing a natural patria would therefore constitute an alternative to the Ciceronian civil patriotism. If Cicero was the key classical authority of civil patriotism, the classical sources of endemic patriotism would include two Roman poets, namely Virgil and Ovid. Virgil and Ovid lyricized the nostalgia for their native country. The Virgil's earlier poetic works, namely Eclogues and Georgics, both contributed to cultivate patriotic sentiments and discourses in their own ways. Having modeled on the Theocritus, the Eclogues became the fountainhead from which the vast and diverse tradition of pastoral in many European literatures was to spring, while Georgics praised Italy as the great mother of man and harvests. Here are some verses that express sentiments about the patria. The Eclogues opens with a verse, I quote, "We are leaving our country's bounds and sweet fields. We are outcasts from our country." Basically, here lamenting the predicament of exile from the pastoral patria. Georgics, on the other hand, includes a section known as the Praise of Italy, or Laudes Italiae, which a commentator describes as an expression of Virgil's uncomplicated confidence in the various aspects of Roman life, and indeed a charming expression of Roman patriotism. Virgil portrays his Italy as a primeval paradise, illustrated by its fertility and absence of predatory animals. After asserting Italy's unparalleled glories, Virgil praises the fertility of the native land. I quote, "The land was filled with teeming crops and Bacchus' massic juice. It is the home of the olive, the home of fattened flocks." Although Eclogues and Georgics have differences in terms of their leitmotif, they share a common ground. They both eulogized the native land. In this sense, Virgil provides an alternative to the Ciceronian ideal of the civil patria. Meanwhile, one cannot overlook Ovid's role in the cultivation of patriotic nostalgia for the natural patria. Ovid's patriotism is distinctively sentimental, which found poetic expression in Ex Ponto. In this work, Ovid wrote, I quote, "The love of country, amor patriae, is more powerful than any reason." Such sentiment is portrayed as the inescapable enchantment of one's native land. I quote again, "By what sweet charm I know not, the native land draws all men, nor allows them to forget her." Ovid's patriotism is overwhelmingly emotional in his attachment to his native land. And all these observations suggest that the Virgil and Ovid are eulogizing what Cicero would have called the natural patria. Such praise of and nostalgia for the native land found the loyal heir in Petrarch. Petrarch's praise of the Italian landscape proved so influential in later centuries that it is worth a comment here. Italy in the early 14th century witnessed civil discord on numerous occasions. Petrarch lamented the contemporary political situation. Indeed, for him, Italy of his day was a lady who was, in his words, old, lazy, and slow. As the country is, again, in Petrarch's words, almost turning into dens of thieves, Petrarch expressed anger towards the Italians. I quote again, "These parvenus are more than a little proud and scarcely reverent to so great a mother," the mother being, of course, Italy. Notice Petrarch represents Italy as a feminine figure. I will come back to this point shortly. Now, in the face of his native country's political confusion, Petrarch expressed a civil patriotism. His enthusiasm for Cola di Rienzi's coup d'etat in 1347 manifested his desire for the restoration of a republican Rome. However, for now, I'd like to underline that Petrarch was a preacher less of civil patriotism than of endemic patriotism. When he referred to Italy in the literary works, he typically eulogized her beauty and expressed sentimental attachment to her. For example, in the sonnet 146, Petrarch hoped that his beloved Laura's virtues and beauty would be praised throughout Italy, if not the entire world. And he wrote, "This world's four corners being unreachable, hear it, that land, the Apennines divide, which is surrounded by the Alps and seas." The English quotation, English translation I cite failed to represent the Dantesque reference to Il bel paese, so that's why I inserted that original phrase, meaning a beautiful country. Perhaps more infamous is the sonnet known as Italia Mia. In that sonnet, Petrarch deplored that foreign mercenaries ruined the beautiful body of Italy. In one respect, this poem represents a call to arms to defend the country. However, such a military patriotism was preponderated by his sentimental attachment to the physical land. In Petrarch's words, "And is it not this where I first learned to walk? And is not this the nest where I was nourished so delightfully? And is not this the land in which I trust, my kind, gentle mother, and not my parents buried in this ground?" In 1353, Petrarch decided to leave Vaucluse, where he had been based since 1337, finally to return to Italy. In a letter written around this time to his native country, Petrarch wrote, "Agnosco patriam, I recognize my own country." The gaze of the poet in exile was cast from the vantage point of southern France, as he once imagined, rather than actually viewed, the land of Italy from the summit of Mount Ventoux. And in this letter, the word patria was used in the sense of home country, not in the sense of the Ciceronian civil patria. While the letter alludes briefly to sacred laws, it foregrounded Italy's admirable landscape and cultural richness and expressed profound nostalgia for the sacred and sublime land of Italy, which would embrace Petrarch's body once he was dead. Petrarch's love of his patria even trumped the political judgment that is a defining feature of civil patriotism, when he went as far as to say that he preferred being a slave in Italy rather than a free man in France. It is worth noting here that Petrarch's lyricism is sharply contrasting to Dante's virulence. In Dante's Purgatory's Canto 6, he writes, "Ah, slavish Italy, thou in of grief, vessel without a pilot, wind loud storm, lady no longer of fair provinces, but brothel house impure." So he also refers to Rome as a desolate widow. Dante's lament takes the form of criticism about the political conditions Italy was in. Petrarch, by contrast, affirmed his love of Italy in spite of all the political misfortunes by eulogizing the land of Italy. Dante preached civil patriotism while Petrarch affirmed endemic patriotism. The Virgilian and Ovidian impulse for celebrating the beauty and fertility of a native land was not unique in Petrarch or to the Italians. The French poets in the late 14th century, such as Eustache Deschamps, mentioned sweet France as an object of affection. The reference to sweet France, which echoes Virgil, is a literary tradition that may go back at least to Chanson de Roland. Furthermore, the glorification of French landscape was commonplace in late medieval official discourses. The Chancellor of France stated in 1484, I quote, "The beauty of the country, the fertility of the soil, and the healthiness of the air outdo all the other countries in the world. The garden of France was the most graceful, the best proportioned, the most temperate, and the richest of all." The eulogy of a natural landscape like this was clearly an alternative to both military and civil patriotism because of its love of the aesthetic and the material qualities of one's birthplace. This revival of a Virgilian and Ovidian patriotic sentiment is highly significant, but there was another strand of ideas that defined medieval variations of endemic patriotism, and that strand of ideas may be summarized as the naturalization of amor patriae, to which I'm now turning. The author I would like to highlight here is Alain Chartier, an early 15th century French administrator in the royal court, a poet and a political writer. In 1422, Chartier wrote the work called Quadriloge Invective. This book took the form of a verbal exchange between four speakers, each of which is a personification of France, the people, the knight, and the clergy, respectively. Chartier wrote this book in the wake of the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which marked England's temporary victory against France in the 100 Years' War. It was before the advent of Joan of Arc. The French kingdom was falling apart, and it was precisely under such a circumstance that the Quadriloge Invective was written as a call for unity in France. This authorial intention is manifested in the very angry invective of the personified France against her three children, the people, the knight, and the clergy. Indeed, the France berates the three sons for their ingratitude and selfish inaction for the common good. Notice that the personified France was the mother to the three. France, in this sense, is best described in English as the motherland. And I'd like to offer 3 observations regarding this. First, I noted earlier that Virgil described Italy as the great mother of man and harvest, and Petrarch personified his country as a lady. In the tradition of what I call endemic patriotism, one's country is often described as a female figure. Chartier's feminine representation of France, of course, helps invoke the need of a chivalric endeavor to rescue the country in accordance with the medieval expectation of masculinity. Indeed, aristocratic males were the Chartier's intended audience. In this connection, it is worth adding that Chartier did not use the word patria. Instead, he wrote of the pays. The patria originates etymologically from the idea of pater, the father, hence patria is often translated as fatherland, and its French translation is typically patrie, so the gender undertone of the word is quite obvious. Although both patria and patrie are grammatically feminine nouns, the Chartier's use of the term pays might be signaling his distancing from the masculine image of patria or patrie. However, it is also known that the French word patrie did not circulate widely before the mid-16th century. Now, my second point is that the metaphor of Mother France generated the imagery of natural wealth. Even though Alain Chartier was writing in the midst of a civil war in France, he still represented France as the land of fertility. So I quote, "At the bottom, which hung towards the earth, one could see interlaced depictions of animals, many plants, fruits, and crops that grew upwards from the hem as if from the rich and fertile soil." Now, I noted earlier that the metaphor of the Garden of France in the late 15th century entailed not only excellent aesthetic qualities, but also the fertility of the land. The agricultural richness of France was acknowledged later by French Renaissance authors such as Jean Bodin and Symphorien Champier, and even by Italians, including Machiavelli. Indeed, in the French Renaissance, France as motherland was often associated mythologically with Cybele and Artemis of Ephesus, both being goddesses of the earth, signifying abundance and regeneration. The visual representation of Cybele and Artemis of Ephesus, featuring a great number of breasts, often provided the model for the figure of nature, underlining the material richness of the earth. And Chartier's imagery of a fertile France set a precedent. My third and perhaps most important point is that, as Daisy Delogue observed, I quote, "At the heart of France's denunciation of her children is the naturalization of love for one's pays or country. The personified France was conceptualized as a biological mother who gave birth to and nourished the 3 children. Chartier also described this relationship between the mother and the children as a natural one. He considered that the natural relationship between mother and children creates a set of obligations on the part of the children. And obligations are metaphorically extrapolated to moral, social, and political ones beyond the obligations surrounding the literary biological relationship between the mother and children. Now, recently, Israeli philosopher Avishai Margalit noted that, I'm quoting him, giving someone life is not necessarily giving someone a good life, but creating something out of nothing creates obligation, which Margalit calls ontological gratitude for being given a life. And Margaret's point is strikingly similar to Chartier's idea of the relationship between France and her 3 children, which highlighted the moral, social, and political obligations of the latter. Here I want to draw your attention to the fact that Chartier characterized those obligations as natural. So he wrote, I quote, "Nature has dedicated you to the common well-being of the country of your birth and the defense of that lordship under which God made you be born and have life." Chartier foregrounded the service to the common good here, thus attuning himself to civil patriotism. However, for him, the service to the common good was a natural duty because loyalty to one's country of birth was also natural. This naturalization of political obligations and communal life is Aristotelian. It is well known that Aristotle considered that the political community was natural, but more noteworthy is the medieval variation of Aristotelian naturalism. While Aristotle distinguished family from the political community, thereby underlining the discontinuity between them, the medieval Aristotelians, such as Giles of Rome, considered that the government of the family and the political community should be modeled on the biological cohesion and unity of the human body, thus underscoring continuity between the family and the community. And this medieval Aristotelian argument undermined the Ciceronian distinction between civil patria and natural patria because the political community is no more than an extrapolation of the family. Now, this argument thereby downplayed the Ciceronian prioritization of the legal and the political character of the civil patria over the naturalness of the birthplace, that is, natural patria. Furthermore, Chartier naturalized not only the patria, but also the love of it. He wrote of an amour naturel du pays, or natural love of one's country. Chartier considered that when the country was divided, desperately needed was the revival of l'affection publique, that is, the affection of the commonweal. Chartier contrasts this public affection with the private and individual affection, that is, the love of private interest. Here again, Chartier attunes himself to civil patriotism. However, Chartier tied this political emotion to what he called son propre lieu, or one's own place. And that's what Chartier's Lady France calls natural love of one's country. The public affection is natural because it is the love of one's native land to which the heart inclines as to its most agreeable dwelling. Nature provides an unshakable bond to one's family and home. For Chartier, the love of country is a natural affection towards one's native country. Chartier's pays, that is, his country, is not the same as the Ciceronian civil patria. It was his country of birth and native land, as the 15th century English translations of a quadrilogue invective acknowledged. But under Aristotle's influence, but probably through Nicolas Rem's commentary, Chartier clearly associated his pays, country, with the idea of common good. Here we can observe Chartier's blending of endemic and civil patriotism, and its result was a departure from the Ciceronian paradigm. Indeed, the Ciceronian prioritization of a civil patria over natural patria is effectively undermined. Clearly, Chartier naturalized the patria and the love of it. This naturalist conception of the love of country constitutes an alternative to what Ernst Kantorowicz once highlighted in his classic account of a pro patria mori in the medieval political thought. As I noted earlier, the Kantorovich foregrounded the Christian theological framework by examining the transposition of the ecclesiological idea of a corpus mysticum to the secular context, thus sanctifying the secular political community. Self-sacrifice for the secular corpus mysticum as the patria thus became an equivalent to martyrdom. The naturalist conception of the love of country, by contrast, was predicated on the biological model of the body politic. As is evident in Chartier's authorial intention is a quadrilogue invective, the biological body politic requires unity. And in this context, nature represents the unbreakable bond of every member to the body politic. Thus, the natural affection for one's country is anchored in the destiny, that is, one's biological and social tie to the country because of one's birth. Now, Kantorovich observed that Aristotelian naturalism could be inserted coherently in the discourse of the corpus mysticum, and he takes the example of Godfrey of Fontaine, who claimed that as a social animal, man is by nature a part of some mystical body, corpus mysticum. The Chartier also acknowledged that the nature's power derived from divine providence. However, his emphasis was on the power of nature itself. Nature constituted the normative foundation of the biological bond of the body politic's members. The naturalist conception of the love of country was consistent with the political theology of the corpus mysticum, but was not necessarily dependent on it. So in summary, medieval endemic patriotism may be characterized in a twofold way. One is the rehabilitation of the Virgilian and Ovidian eulogy of native lands, beauty, and fertility. The other is the Aristotelian naturalization of the patria and the love of it. The object of patriotic love is reduced to nothing other than one's native land, and it is natural to love and admire it. And this idea sounds familiar to us today as a popular form of patriotism. Now, I would like to round off this talk by commenting on the legacy of medieval patriotism, especially the endemic one. Petrarch and Alan Chartier represent two strands of the ideas which shaped medieval variations of endemic patriotism: the Petrarchan eulogy of the native land and the Chartier's naturalization of the love of country converged in the third quarter of the 16th century to create an indelible mode of expressing a local and a national sense of place. The so-called the Pleiad poets, represented by Du Bellay and Ronsard, succeeded in creating the idealized expressions of French pastoral landscape. In this poetic endeavor, one cannot overlook the significance of the Virgilian and Ovidian influence. Meanwhile, Chartier's naturalization of the love of country also found a loyal heir in Du Bellay. Du Bellay celebrated the natural love of one's patrie. But his endemic patriotism was not characterized by the Petrarchan eulogy of native land and the Chartier's naturalization of the love of country alone. The project of Du Bellay and his fellow Pleiad poets went further by refining and glorifying the French language through their poetic works. This endeavor was defined by the poets themselves as a patriotic project. Accordingly, Du Bellay redefined patrie as a linguistic community, that is, the community of speakers who share the responsibility of nurturing their common language. His patrie was not a political community that one belonged to by law. It was his country of birth, France, and at the same time, a cultural community that one belonged to by sharing the same language. Du Bellay thus elevated natural patria from the status subservient to the civil patria to an alternative ideal. Interestingly, Tudor England hardly eulogized English natural landscape. William Shakespeare's Richard II famously compared England with a garden that is full of weeds. I quote Shakespeare here, her fairest flower chalked up, her fruit trees all upturned, her hedges ruined, her knots disordered, and her wholesome herbs swarming with caterpillars. Instead, Shakespeare's Henry V described France as the garden of the world. The Virgilian eulogy of native land remained irrelevant. However, the naturalization of the love of country infiltrated the patriotic discourses in Tudor England. For example, when the humanist and the politician Sir Richard Morrison commented on Cardinal Reginald Pole's remark, Roma mihi patria est, he translated the cardinal's words as Rome is my native country. Thus, Morrison ridiculed the cardinal because he was obviously not born in Rome. Morrison even condemned the cardinal for being treacherous. In understanding patria as a native country, Morrison was not an isolated case. Indeed, vernacular polemical writings in Tudor England are replete with expressions like native country, and most significantly, natural love of native country. It was deemed natural to love one's native country, and this type of endemic patriotism was becoming a mainstream in 16th century England. The legacy of medieval variations of endemic patriotism survived and indeed flourished well beyond the 16th century. As for the eulogy of native land, suffice to mention the influential idea of picturesque in 18th century Britain, which cultivated patriotic sentiments through the aesthetic appreciation of a natural landscape of one's native country in the Anglophone countries. In terms of a naturalization of love of country, perhaps it is worth noting that Anthony Ashley Cooper, 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury, lamented in 1711 that the English language did not have the word patria, but country. He deplored that the Ciceronian idea of a civil patria receded in the face of the proliferation of what he called the patriots of the soil. Shaftesbury's complaint was historically not unfounded. Indeed, 16th century English Latin dictionary translated country as patria. If I rephrase Shaftesbury's qualm, endemic patriotism was responsible for the coagulation of the object of patriotic loyalty, increasingly reducing patria to the country of one's birth, as if it were historically necessary and irreversible. However, the patriotic discourses in the past, the Ciceronian distinction between the civil patria and the natural patria, for example, reminds us that the idea of patria is not given. The French philosopher Simone Weil noted this around 1942 in her work, The Need for Roots, as follows, I quote, "What had never existed right up to recent times was some definite circumscribed thing, permanently installed as an object of patriotic devotion. Patriotism was something diffuse, nomadic, which expanded or contracted according to degrees of similarity and common danger. It was mixed up with different kinds of loyalty, loyalty to other man, a lord, a king, or a city. The whole formed something very complicated, but also very human. To express the sense of obligation everyone feels towards his country, people would usually talk about the public or the public good, an expression which can serve equally well to indicate a village, town, province, France, Christendom, or mankind. It should be easy to see that Simone Weil echoed diverse conceptions of patria in the Middle Ages, which I have outlined. I hope I have shown you that the late medieval variations of endemic patriotism paved the way to a popular understanding of patriotism, that it is natural to love one's native country because it is our own. But the history of patriotism suggests that there were many other conceptions of patria. The whole point of this history is to remind ourselves that patriotism is open to our imagination about how we envisage the patria. Thank you very much.